Admiral Threx stood still in the observation room, staring at the large viewing window as the soft hum of the station surrounded him, his eyes fixed on the human child, sitting at the controls of a starship simulator. The boy could not have been more than 10 years old, yet he seemed utterly absorbed in the game, as if nothing else in the galaxy mattered. The child's fingers danced across the control panel, his face focused and determined as his virtual starship moved with surprising agility through the simulated asteroid field and enemy ships. Threx was not accustomed to such displays of concentration from humans. He had seen the way they stumbled through battles with primitive technology in the past. They were barely a threat in the grand scheme of galactic warfare. Their ships lacked speed, their weapons were crude at best, and their strategies were haphazard, yet this child was different. Something about the way he controlled the simulation made Threx pause in his judgment. The boy moved with precision, not like the chaos he had expected, but with a skill that hinted at something deeper, something that unsettled him. The Admiral crossed his arms, his mind racing. He had seen many alien species engage in combat, each with their unique strengths and weaknesses, but never had he encountered a species that could harness instinct and instinct alone. In such a way, humanity was supposed to be weak, supposed to be incapable of mastering the art of war, and yet this child was doing exactly that. Threx watched as the boy skillfully dodged a barrage of simulated plasma fire, narrowly avoiding the attack with a maneuver that seemed almost too perfect to be random. His ship twisted through the simulated chaos, almost as though it were an extension of his own body. Threx's thoughts began to shift from the boy's actions to the implications of those actions. If this child was capable of such precision at this young age, what would he be like as an adult? What kind of potential did humanity possess if they were capable of breeding tactical minds like this? Was this really just a game? Was the boy playing, or was he practicing for something far more important? The child's ship soared through the simulation, avoiding an incoming wave of virtual attackers. His movements were calculated and swift. Every decision he made seemed to be the result of careful thought, rather than luck. The Admiral could not help but be captivated by the boy's ability to read the flow of the game, as if he had spent years learning the ins and outs of starship combat. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. The child knew exactly what to do and when to do it, and with each move Threx felt his unease grow. What was this child doing in a simulation room on a station filled with alien soldiers? Was this really just a form of entertainment, or was there something more to it? Threx leaned forward as the boy executed another perfect move, his starship narrowly escaping the deadly fire of an enemy warship. The Admiral's mind raced. Could this human be the product of some new training technique? Was this part of a larger experiment? Was this really just a game to the child, or was there something hidden beneath the surface, something the Admiral was missing? The more Threx watched, the more he began to realize that what he was witnessing was not simply a game at all. The boy was playing something far more dangerous, a game that was very much real. Threx stood frozen as he watched the boy navigate the virtual battlefield with an almost unnatural calm. His small hands gripped the controls of the simulator, and his eyes never wavered from the screen. The Admiral could feel a knot forming in his stomach as the child weaved effortlessly through enemy fire and asteroid fields, taking out enemy ships with ease. It was not just the boy's skill that intrigued him, it was the way he moved, the way he responded to the virtual threats, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The boy was not merely playing a game, he was fighting a battle. The child executed another flawless move as he turned the starship on its axis just in time to avoid a blast from a pursuing enemy ship. Threx watched as the boy's ship dove into the virtual asteroid field and used the rocks as cover from the enemy's attacks. It was a textbook maneuver, one that a seasoned veteran might employ in the heat of battle, but here was a child doing it with no hesitation, no fear. The Admiral's mind raced. Could this child have been trained by someone? Did the humans have some secret fleet academy hidden away where they were teaching children such advanced tactics? Was this the result of some new form of combat training, or was it something more? Threx's thoughts were interrupted as the child's ship launched a series of rapid-fire missiles that disabled an entire fleet of enemy vessels. The boy was calm and focused. Every move he made was deliberate, and calculated Threx found himself questioning everything he knew about humans and their capabilities. He had always thought of them as little more than an inconvenience, a species too primitive to pose any real threat. But here was evidence to the contrary. This child was proving to be more than capable of outsmarting and outmaneuvering a highly advanced alien fleet in a simulation. No less, it was as though the boy was born for this purpose, as if he had an innate understanding of war and strategy that transcended any form of traditional training. The Admiral's unease grew as he continued to watch the boy's progress. The child was not merely reacting to the simulation, he was anticipating its every move. His reflexes were sharp, and his mind seemed to be operating on a level that Threx had not seen in many of his most skilled officers. The boy was not just playing a game, he was reading the flow of the battle and adjusting his strategy in real time. This was something far beyond what any ordinary human child should be capable of. It was as though the child's mind was wired for combat, and it was a terrifying thought. Threx leaned forward, pressing his hands against the glass, as the boy's starship soared through the virtual battlefield. Once more, he had to know more about this child. He had to understand what made him different. Was this a sign of something greater within humanity, something that had been hidden until now, something that could change the entire course of the galaxy? The Admiral's mind swirled with questions, but there was one thing he knew for sure: this child was no ordinary human, and the implications of what he was witnessing were far more significant than he had initially realized. The boy completed the simulation in record time with perfect efficiency. As his ship destroyed the final enemy vessel, the virtual battlefield cleared, and the simulation ended. The child slowly stood up from the controls and walked away, his expression unchanged, as if he had simply finished another game. Threx watched the boy leave the room, his mind still reeling from what he had just witnessed. He couldn't shake the feeling that humanity was not what he had thought them to be, and that this child was the first sign of something much larger than he could have ever anticipated. Threx couldn't shake the image of the boy from his mind. As he walked down the long corridors of the space station, the child's face remained unchanged, calm and focused, but the Admiral could feel the tension building within him. The more he thought about what he had just witnessed, the more unsettled he became. This wasn't just a simple simulation. This was a glimpse into something far greater, something he wasn't prepared for. Threx had seen many battles in his lifetime, fought countless wars against species far more advanced than humanity. But this child, this human child, had done something he hadn't expected. He had made him question everything he thought he knew about humans. As Threx walked deeper into the station, his mind drifted back to his past battles and the lessons he had learned through countless engagements. He remembered the first time he had fought against an enemy fleet far superior to his own, the strategies he had to employ, the quick thinking, the ability to adapt on the fly. It had been a grueling experience, one that had taught him the importance of instinct and timing. Threx had always prided himself on his ability to read a battle, to know when to strike and when to retreat, but now he couldn't help but wonder if this was something the boy had mastered without even realizing it. The Admiral entered his command center and immediately ordered his officers to review the footage from the simulation. His mind was still reeling from the boy's performance. He needed to understand what had just happened. He needed to know if this was something that could be replicated, or if it was a fluke. He watched as the images of the boy's moves appeared on the screen. Every decision the child made, every move he executed, was studied with precision. The officers were silent as they reviewed the footage. Threx's eyes narrowed as he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The boy's movements were not just reactive, they were anticipatory. The child seemed to predict the movements of the enemy ships before they even occurred. It was as if the boy was seeing the future. Threx leaned forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and fear. He had never seen anything like this before. He had always known that the greatest commanders were those who could think ahead, who could predict what the enemy would do before they did it. But this child was doing it effortlessly, and without thought. The boy's mind was operating on a level Threx had never encountered. It was as if he had been born with an innate understanding of war, a gift that could not be taught or learned. It was something that had to be inside him from the beginning. The Admiral's thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. If this child was capable of such things, What did that mean for humanity as a whole? Could they all possess this kind of instinctual brilliance? Or was the boy an anomaly? Threx had to know more. He had to understand what made this child different. Was there something in the human genome, something that allowed them to tap into this level of strategic genius? Or was it just the result of years of training and refinement? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for certain: this child was a harbinger of something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Threx ordered a full investigation into the boy's background. He needed to know where he came from, who had trained him, and if there were others like him in the human race. He couldn't afford to underestimate humanity any longer, not after what he had seen. The boy was a symbol of something bigger, something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The Admiral's heart pounded as he realized that what he had dismissed as a simple game was in fact a glimpse of the future of war, and it was a future he was not prepared for. Threx could not shake the unease that had settled deep within him. Since the simulation ended, his mind continued to churn with the possibilities as he paced back and forth in his command room. The boy was a mystery, something that defied explanation, and Threx knew he had to dig deeper. He had to understand what made the child tick, so he could properly assess the potential threat humanity posed. He could no longer dismiss them as weak or unorganized, not with what he had witnessed. He ordered a full report on the boy's history, his family background, and any known training programs that may have been linked to him. The Admiral needed to know if there was something special about this child, or if his actions were the result of some new human initiative designed to enhance their strategic abilities. But Threx already knew deep down that this was something different. This wasn't the product of training or education. This was something innate, something that humans might have all along, and had simply not had the opportunity to fully develop. As the hours passed, Threx's officers combed through the boy's personal records. They discovered little to explain the child's exceptional abilities. Born into a modest family on a small human colony, the boy had no formal training beyond the standard education required for his age. There was no record of military involvement, no record of any specialized learning programs, and yet his performance in the simulation was beyond anything Threx had ever seen. Frustration began to build in the Admiral as he stared at the results. He had been hoping for some clue, something that would make sense of it all. But instead, he was left with more questions than answers. How could a child with no training or experience possess such an incredible understanding of warfare? It didn't make sense. Threx leaned back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair. This was more than a simple anomaly. It was something that could change everything. The Admiral stood up and walked over to the observation window once again, his eyes locked onto the vast expanse of space beyond the station's walls. He could feel the weight of the decision before him. If humans were capable of producing children like this boy, then they could potentially dominate the galaxy in ways no one had ever imagined. The boy had shown an innate understanding of strategy and tactics far beyond his years, and Threx realized that if humanity could harness this potential, it would be a force that could not be stopped. The Admiral's thoughts shifted to the bigger picture. If humanity's children were capable of such brilliance, then what about their adults? What about the soldiers, the generals, the commanders? How many others were out there with the same level of instinctual genius? If Threx had underestimated this boy, he had undoubtedly underestimated humanity as a whole, and the thought chilled him to his core. He ordered his officers to prepare for the next phase of the investigation. They would need to test more of the human children and see if they exhibited the same capabilities. He couldn't risk leaving this to chance, not when the fate of the galaxy might be at stake. He had to know the truth. He had to know if humanity truly possessed the potential to change the course of the war. As Threx stood there staring out at the endless stars, he felt the weight of his realization sink in. Humanity was no longer just a nuisance, they were a threat, and the boy had only been the first hint of what was to come. Threx couldn't stop thinking about the boy and the implications of what he had witnessed. As the days passed, the Admiral became consumed by the idea of human potential. He could feel the weight of his realization pressing on him every waking moment. Humanity was not just some insignificant species in the galaxy. They had something deeper, something he had failed to see until now. The boy had unlocked something within him, something that made Threx question everything he knew about warfare and strategy. The investigation into the boy's background continued, but it led to no new answers. The child's family was ordinary, with no military connections, and no unusual events to explain his behavior. He had not received any special training or exposure to advanced technology. It made no sense. How could he be so good at something he had never been taught? Threx knew there was more to this, but the deeper he dug, the more elusive the truth became. He couldn't help but feel like he was chasing shadows. The Admiral spent hours reviewing simulations from other human subjects in an attempt to find someone who exhibited similar skills, but each time he watched, he found nothing of note. The other children lacked the same sharpness and foresight that the boy had displayed. Their movements were reactive instead of anticipatory. They stumbled through the simulations unaware of their surroundings, while the boy had moved with a precision that could only come from a mind that saw the bigger picture. Threx's frustration deepened as he realized the boy was unique in ways he could not explain. Threx called a meeting with his most trusted officers in the hopes of finding some kind of solution. They gathered in the war room, a large chamber filled with screens showing tactical data and simulation results. The Admiral stood at the head of the table, his face grave as he addressed them. He spoke of the boy's performance and what it might mean for humanity. He explained that the child's ability to predict movements and read battles with such clarity was unlike anything they had ever seen. One of the officers spoke up, suggesting that perhaps this was just a fluke or a product of some strange quirk in the child's mind. But Threx was not so easily convinced. He knew better than to dismiss what he had seen with a simple explanation. The boy's brilliance had to come from somewhere. There had to be something in his biology or his upbringing that made him different from the others. But if that was true, where had it come from? The Admiral's mind raced as he considered the possibility of a new kind of human evolution. Could it be that humanity had been evolving in ways they hadn't realized, that they had unlocked a hidden potential deep within their minds? Threx began to suspect that the boy was not an isolated case, but a sign of something much larger. If this child was the product of a new stage in human development, what could that mean for the galaxy? Threx turned his attention back to the simulation room. He had to see the boy again. He had to know if the child's abilities were as unique as he had thought, or if there was something more behind them. The Admiral ordered the child to participate in another simulation, this time with an even greater level of difficulty. He wanted to test the limits of the boy's abilities and see if they could truly replicate the same brilliance that had left him so stunned. The stakes were higher now. If the boy succeeded once again, Threx would have no choice but to acknowledge the terrifying truth: humanity was more dangerous than anyone had ever thought. The child entered the simulation room, once more his expression unchanged as he sat down at the controls. Threx watched from the observation room. As the boy began the test, he could feel the tension in the air. As the simulation began, the boy's fingers moved across the console with practiced ease. His eyes narrowed in focus as he assessed the battlefield and the simulation's challenges. Threx held his breath. He knew this was a defining moment. Everything was riding on what would happen next. The simulation began, and Threx watched as the boy took control of the starship with a calm confidence that left the Admiral speechless. From the first moment, the child's movements were fluid and precise. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Each action seemed to come naturally, as though he were born to command a vessel through the chaos of battle. Threx could feel the tension rising as the difficulty level of the simulation increased. Enemy ships materialized from all directions, their weapons firing relentlessly at the boy's ship. But the child was unfazed. His hands moved across the console in rapid succession, executing evasive maneuvers and counterattacks with a level of coordination that defied belief. As the simulation progressed, Threx could see the boy's strategy unfolding. His ship was outnumbered, yet he continued to gain ground despite the overwhelming odds. It was like watching a master tactician in action, someone who understood the ebb and flow of battle so well that they could predict their opponent's every move. Threx had seen this kind of brilliance before, but only in the greatest military leaders of his own people, not in a human child, not in a species that had once been considered primitive and unrefined. The boy's ship dodged incoming fire effortlessly and took down enemy vessels with pinpoint accuracy. It was as if he was playing a game, But Threx knew better. This wasn't a game, it was a test of survival, and the boy was passing with flying colors. Threx leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen as the child's ship made a sharp turn and launched a devastating barrage of missiles at the enemy fleet, destroying several ships in one swift move. The boy wasn't just reacting to the simulation, he was controlling it, shaping the outcome with every decision he made. Threx could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the boy continued to dominate the simulation with ease. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He had known that humanity was capable of great things, but this was something else entirely. This was not just about intelligence or training. This was something that went beyond the physical or mental limitations of the species. This was instinct, pure and simple, an understanding of war that was so deep it seemed almost supernatural. The simulation reached its final phase, and the boy's ship faced off against the largest enemy ship of all, a massive warship that had been designed to test even the most experienced pilots. Threx watched as the child sized up the situation. He could see the boy's mind at work, his eyes flicking from one section of the battlefield to the next, calculating the best way to approach the situation. Threx had no doubt that the child would succeed, but what truly stunned him was the boy's complete lack of fear or anxiety. There was no hesitation as the boy's ship launched a series of rapid attacks on the warship, taking out its defenses with surgical precision. Threx could feel a sense of awe building within him as the child's starship finished the final blow to the enemy warship. The simulation ended with the boy's victory, and the virtual battlefield disappeared. The child stood up from the controls, his expression as calm as it had been when he first entered the room. He didn't show any sign of excitement or triumph. He simply walked away, as if he had just completed an ordinary task. Threx stood motionless in the observation room, watching the boy leave. His thoughts were a blur. The simulation had proven everything he feared. Humanity had something no one could have anticipated. They had the potential to become a force unlike any other in the galaxy, and it was a force that could change the future of everything. The Admiral's mind was made up. This child was no fluke. This was the beginning of something far greater. Humanity was not just a threat, they were the future, and that future was terrifying. Threx stood frozen in the observation room, his mind still reeling from the boy's performance. In the simulation, he had watched the child move with such ease and confidence that it was hard to believe he was just a human child. It was as though the boy had tapped into something far beyond what anyone could have expected. Threx's thoughts raced as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. If humanity was capable of producing minds like this, then the entire balance of power in the galaxy could shift in their favor. The Admiral felt a wave of dread wash over him as the full weight of the situation hit him. Humanity had always been considered a lesser species. Their technology had been crude, their strategies primitive, their understanding of the larger galactic conflicts limited. But now Threx was beginning to understand that this perception had been wrong. The boy's abilities were not an isolated incident. Threx had seen the child's brilliance and instinct firsthand, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that there were others like him out there waiting to emerge. He knew he had to act fast. The implications of this discovery were far-reaching. Humanity's potential was something that could not be underestimated, and if other species in the galaxy caught wind of this, their approach to humans could change overnight. What had once been considered a small nuisance could soon turn into the most formidable opponent any of them had ever faced. Threx's instincts told him that humanity would not remain quiet for long. It was only a matter of time before the rest of the galaxy saw what the boy's performance meant, and once that happened, it would be impossible to reverse the tide of history. The Admiral returned to his command center and called an emergency meeting with his highest-ranking officers. They gathered around the table, all eyes on Threx as he entered and took his seat. Without a word, he activated the holographic display, showing footage from the boy's most recent simulation. The officers stared in silence as the image of the boy's flawless performance filled the room, each of them processing what they were seeing. Threx watched their reactions closely, and it was clear that none of them had anticipated such a display of skill and strategy from a human child. One of the officers spoke up, asking what it meant for their forces and how they should proceed. Threx looked at him, his face hardening as he realized the full gravity of the situation. Humanity could no longer be treated as an afterthought. They could not be dismissed as insignificant any longer. Threx's voice was low and steady as he spoke. We can no longer view humanity as weak or disorganized. They have shown us that they possess potential beyond what we could have imagined, and if we do not act swiftly, we will find ourselves unprepared for what's to come. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The officers nodded grimly, acknowledging the truth of what he said. Threx continued, "We will need to assess the human threat on a much larger scale. We cannot afford to underestimate them or assume this boy is an anomaly. Humanity's ability to produce minds like his could very well be widespread, and if they are able to harness this potential, then they will become a force unlike anything we've ever encountered." The officers began to discuss what steps needed to be taken next. They debated whether they should engage with humanity directly or take a more cautious approach. Threx remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "Whatever we decide, we must act quickly. This is no longer a question of if humanity will be a threat. It is a question of when we will face them. We must prepare for the future and for what is coming next." As the meeting continued, Threx felt a sense of foreboding settle over him. Humanity was no longer something to be ignored. They had proven themselves to be far more dangerous than anyone had ever believed. The boy had only been the first sign of what was to come, and Threx knew that the galaxy was about to change in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Threx stood alone in his command center, staring at the stars beyond the station, his mind still consumed by the gravity of the situation. The future of the galaxy seemed uncertain. Now humanity had proven itself to be a force of unimaginable potential, and Threx could no longer ignore the implications of what that meant. His thoughts circled back to the boy and the inexplicable brilliance he had shown. But it wasn't just about the child anymore. Humanity had become something that needed to be reckoned with on a much larger scale. The Admiral had spent countless hours reviewing every piece of data he could gather on humanity, their military capabilities, their advancements in technology, and their political landscape. But the more he searched, the more he found that humanity was unpredictable. There was no clear path forward, no way to know for certain how they would respond to the challenges of the galaxy. But Threx had to admit that this uncertainty was exactly what made them so dangerous. They had shown themselves to be adaptable, resilient, and capable of incredible innovation, even without the same resources and experience that other species possessed. Threx had once thought of humanity as a species to be dealt with when necessary, an obstacle to be pushed aside in the larger galactic conflict. But now he saw them in an entirely different light. Their potential was vast and largely untapped. The boy had proven that there was a deeper layer of strategy and intuition in humans that no one had expected. And if there were more like him out there, then the galaxy was in for a much more complicated future than anyone had imagined. As he walked through the halls of the station, Threx's mind raced with possible scenarios. If humanity could indeed produce leaders and tacticians like the boy, then their ability to form powerful coalitions could change the balance of power across the galaxy. They could join forces with other species or remain independent, but either way they would no longer be easily dismissed. The child had shown that humans were capable of mastering the art of war in ways that no one had ever thought possible, and Threx feared that soon other species would come to the same conclusion. The Admiral's focus shifted to the larger issue of strategy. Humanity's future was now inextricably linked to the shifting tides of galactic warfare. What would happen when other powers saw the same potential in humanity that Threx had begun to understand? Would there be attempts to manipulate them or destroy them? Would they be drawn into the ever-growing conflicts, or would they seek to carve their own path, a path that would challenge the established order of the galaxy? Threx understood that humanity had the potential to reshape everything. They were no longer just a species to be tolerated or dismissed. They were a species that would force the galaxy to change its perception of them. And that thought sent a chill through the Admiral's bones. He had always been prepared for battle, but this was something new. Humanity was no longer just a threat. They were a force that could challenge the very foundation of galactic power. Threx made his decision. Humanity would not be ignored any longer. The galaxy needed to understand the truth about what was coming, and it needed to be prepared. The time for underestimating them was over the future of the galaxy depended on what came next, and Threx could not afford to stand idly by as humanity evolved into something that could change everything forever. He turned away from the observation window, his mind clear for the first time in days. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure: humanity had become a new player on the galactic stage, and they would no longer be treated as insignificant. He had seen enough to know that their future was bound to shape the course of everything to come.